let me pull up my notes here. Our first speaker is Brian Treanor. He's Charles S. Casasa Professor of Philosophy at Loyola Marymount University. His most recent works include Melancholy Joy, Philosophy in the American West, and Carnal Hermeneutics. His talk today is titled The Social Contract and the Natural Contract.
Thanks, and thanks for the folks attending. I wanted to say a quick couple of words first that I'm really happy to be on this panel and on this subject. Christopher and Marylin and I talked about it after Michel Serres passed away in 2019, and I think it's nice that SPEP is sort of marking the significance of his philosophy. I'm also happy to be on the panel with these two people, both of whom have written kind of remarkable books that, if we're recording this or we've got some guests here are interested, Marylin's book on eco-affectivity, it's eco-affectivity, is a really original and excellent work. And Marylin, I'm just returning from the PACT conference that you know about, and inspired by some conversations with Chris Lauer and his family, I'm actually starting an article where I'm going to be using as my main foil, my main interlocutor, your book. So I'm really enjoying that. I also, for this panel, want to recommend to everyone that we're recording here Christopher's new book on Michel Serres, which is a really remarkable achievement. Christopher's facility with the French is better than my own. I've been reading Michel Serres for a number of years, largely in the English translations, but also some of the French work. And I've bandied about in my head the idea of writing a book in English about Michel Serres to try and introduce his thought to a wider English-speaking audience. And I have to say, I mean, Christopher has done it much better than I ever would have been able to do it. It's a really great introduction if you want something to sort of open up the thought of a really truly idiosyncratic thinker, Michel Serres. I've joked before in some things I've written for him in memoriam and things like that he's a tradition of one, right? He's not a continental philosopher. He's not an analytic philosopher. He's a very interesting thinker. Okay. I don't have PowerPoints, although that might have been a good idea on Zoom, because I'm basically working with the paper from a year ago before everything changed. On June 1st, 2019, Michel Serres died in Paris, and he left behind many decades of influential work: books, essays, interviews, lectures, podcasts, and more. However, in general, Serres has been sorely neglected by Anglophone philosophers. There are no doubt many reasons for this. First, it's the sheer size of his body of work. I've seen different counts in Chris's book and in other memorials, but scores of books, certainly. Second, much of this work has until recently been untranslated. We can thank Randy Burks and some other people for really churning out some recent translations of Serres' work into English, but it's fairly recent. But then, and perhaps most problematically, Serres stood outside the philosophical camps or traditions as they're commonly understood. Although he was incredibly well read, not only in philosophy, but in literature, science, politics, and more, he was, as I just said, in some sense, a tradition of one. For philosophers trained as narrow specialists, or for those who participate, even fruitfully, in detailed insider debates, it's hard to know how to engage Serres in his work. Is he an epistemologist, a philosophical anthropologist, a philosopher of language, an empiricist, a philosopher of science, a commentator on technology? The challenging truth is that Serres is all of these and more. I've written elsewhere about the contributions I believe his thinking can make to hermeneutics, even though he himself is a critic in some way of hermeneutics, as I just read in one of the subsections of Chris's here. He's allergic to what his version of what he thinks of as the hermeneutics of suspicion. What I want to focus on today is a different topic, and that is Serres as an important and strikingly original, I would say even prescient, environmental thinker. This aspect of his thinking is on display in works like Le Contrat Naturel, Homme in Essence, Le Malpropre Habité, and Biologie, on which Marylin has also written, translated as Biologia. And several of these are either available or soon to be available in English. But here I want to take up his book, The Natural Contract, which was translated into English in 1995. In it, he argues that we, humanity, must come to terms with the ways in which humanity, taken as a collective, is now interacting with nature, viewed globally. Among the several remarkable things about this work is the degree to which it anticipates contemporary concern with the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene, both in scholarly and popular literature. While the idea behind the Anthropocene pops up in informal and preliminary ways earlier and elsewhere, it was only brought to its current usage around 2000 after adoption by Paul Crutzen and others, and has only become widely recognized in perhaps the last decade. Viewed in this light, Serres' work seems far-sighted indeed. Bill McKibben's The End of Nature was published in 1989, and that is commonly thought of as popularizing the concern about climate change outside of a scientific community. Just a year earlier, The End of Nature was 1 year earlier than the French version of The Natural Contract, which was in 1990. And so in some senses, Serres must be seen as a philosophical first responder in recognizing the environmental crisis as a truly global phenomenon. As Baird Callicott, who's a well-known environmental philosopher, writes, quote, just as Nass, Routley, Ralston, and I, that is Callicott, are widely acknowledged to be the founders of environmental ethics, Serres and Jameson should be widely acknowledged as the founders of climate ethics. That is, no longer quoting, that is something like the ethics of the Anthropocene, insofar as, on my view, climate change is arguably the marker par excellence of the Anthropocene. Serres begins his account of The Natural Contract with a reflection on Goya's Fight with Cudgels, the famous painting, Dulo Agaratoso. One of Goya's so-called black paintings, which he painted directly onto the walls of his home in the early 1820s, it depicts two men armed with sticks fighting beneath a patchy sky in a dim, gray-green countryside. It's a familiar scene, both in history and fiction. Two men bludgeoning each other over some seemingly insolvable disagreement, whether land, money, or kin. Both appear disheveled with exertion. Blood courses down the cheek of one combatant, perhaps the mark of the blow that began the struggle. But what seems unusual, and which has elicited attention from interpreters and art critics, is that both men appear to be immersed in mud up to their knees. Now, whether this was intended by Goya or as an artifact of the paintings having been removed from his bedroom walls and restored to museum is up for debate. But when you look at this, up to their knees, it looks like they're immersed in mud. The fight, the painting, sets Serres to wondering about the nature of violence, a concern one can hear, though in different keys, in much of his work. Here, however, his interest is not so much in how violence begins, but in how it's controlled. There's a long philosophical tradition expressed most clearly in Hobbes, Rousseau, and Locke that holds that human conflict is constrained or regulated by a social contract. In a Hobbesian state of nature, our experience would be of violence unconstrained. Every man for himself, the war of all against all. Such a life would be famously solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Consequently, people come together and sign an agreement, right? A theoretical signature, in which they give up certain rights or freedoms in exchange for the assurance of protection of other rights. Under the social contract, violence becomes regulated. Some forms of violence are sanctioned in certain circumstances, but much violence becomes prohibited and punishable. When violence is permitted, it takes place according to rules prescribing its objects and limits. So even in war, for all the barbarity of war and all the moral hazard, there are rules of a sort, distinguishing friend from enemy, and even legislating the conduct of combatants against enemies. Whether people follow those rules or not, we attempt to legislate those sorts of things. So at a most basic level, war distinguishes between ally and enemy, and even the unhinged soldier perpetrating a war crime is not, in most cases, in danger of turning with similar evil on his brothers in arms. Under the social contract, we've escaped the state of war of all against all for a state of controlled violence, some against some, and only in some cases. That, of course, does not make war good. It simply makes it less worse than an alternative. And ultimately, the goal is not to rest easy, having escaped unconstrained savagery for at least a somewhat restrained state of war, but having done so to take a further step from war to peace. So well and good, that's a background in social contract that I'm sure is familiar to everyone here. But the image of the social contract is fundamentally incomplete. When we think of conflict, we think of the two combatants, Achilles and Hector, Napoleon and Wellington, the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment, and the opposing German forces. But what we forget, and we forget this ironically given all the talk of a state of nature, is that every battle takes place in a place, on terrain, in an environment, which is itself also involved in the conflict. In the above instances, these places would be the ringing plains of windy Troy, as Tennyson has it, or the rolling hills of Waterloo, or the farms and copses of trees of the Marne Valley and Belleau Wood. Indeed, it's telling that prior to the advent of environmental histories, even quite detailed accounts of battles are incredibly sparse in terms of detailed environmental description, unrelated to the tactical advantage or disadvantages of combat. So we know about the hills of Waterloo because Wellington used them tactically to defeat Napoleon, but we don't know about the other elements of the environment there. As a consequence, we forget that the earth itself is always present in, it's the always present environs in which our conflicts unfold. Goya's duelists beat each other senseless, each one fixated on avoiding the blows of the enemy and seeking to deliver the decisive blow himself, all the while oblivious to the fact that their struggle is churning up and destroying the very land in which they battle for dominance, and that as a consequence, they're slowly sinking into the quagmire produced by their own furious thrashing, pulled down together. For Serres, this painting is a distilled image of human conflict, whether the violence is physical, economic, or social, or even philosophical. It reveals something essential. The earth is in effect a third party in all our conflicts, not as a stage or backdrop for human conflict, but as a participant in, and often a victim of, the conflict itself. The role of the earth in a conflict has understandably gone unnoticed for much of human history. This is not to say that the damage done to it was insignificant, merely to say that for the vast majority of human history, the role of the earth in human conflict was not ultimately determinative. It could affect the conflict between combatants, as when Wellington used the reverse slope of the ridge at Waterloo to conceal his forces from Napoleon. It could directly shape the course of the battle, as when General Winter helped to eject Napoleon from Russia. The destruction of ecosystems could harm local people through loss of crops or livelihood. And finally, of course, from a more enlightened and non-anthropocentric perspective, the destruction of the terrain and the ecosystems were harms in themselves. That's all true, but generally speaking, the harms were local and specific. They weren't global, as it were. However, relatively recently, something's changed. And the earth, long a factor, even an agent in human conflict, is now, as it were, fighting back. So what has changed? As with many things today, we can find the answer by considering the scale of the issue. The social contract makes the most sense and is most effective when viewed at the human scale. However, this view, the scale of things, of human things, has been under pressure for some time. Indeed, there's good reason to think that this was a serious problem, even at the scale of the nation state used by the great philosophers of the social contract. Devin and I were talking about environmental philosophy before you all popped in, and one of the major articles in environmental philosophy that everyone reads is Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons, right? And Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for sort of suggesting the tragedy of the commons doesn't always take place, that there are many commons that have been managed sustainably for generations in indigenous communities and smaller communities. That works in smaller communities precisely because they're smaller and the relationships are more connected. But the tragedy of the commons is going to unfold with precisely the tragedy that Hardin thinks about when we're looking at a global commons, like the climate. So while social contract theory might apply, for example, I'm skeptical of even this size, to Rousseau's France or Hobbes's England, the social contract works best in smaller communities in which the tragedy of the commons, free ridership, and similar problems are more easily addressed. As such communities grow, the social contract requires bureaucracy and institutions to function. And as it grows further, even those buttresses to the edifice become strained. Today, we've reached a scale, a global scale, that's going to require rewriting the contract itself rather than tinkering with its implementation. The social contract is something we've generally thought about in terms of relatively distinct groups. The citizens of the village of Ambleside, or the city of Leeds, or England, existing in relatively distinct places, that is the Lake District, or Great Britain, or Northern Europe. In such a context, conflict and violence were phenomena that had only local effects. Particular groups perpetrated violence and particular groups suffered from it. And when nature was harmed, it was harmed in a local way. But humans in the Anthropocene are now a global power. We can debate about the date of this metamorphosis or metastasis, but the consequence is no longer in dispute. When we think about violence, at least in certain instances, we have to think about the relationship of humanity taken as a whole to nature taken as a whole. What does this mean for the social contract? Serres' work suggests that our conception of the social contract is deficient in at least two senses. First, it's ill-equipped to account for global relationships. Traditionally, no one thought of the social contract as a contract among all humans, only as a contract between, for example, Americans, citizens of the United States, or Californians, or some other subset of humans. Second, the social contract exists between people. More than human nature does not factor into it. And even if we were to include more than human nature, the first deficiency suggests we generally think of it in equally local terms. The grazing commons of the Sierra Nevada foothills here in California, for example. Thus, the social contract fails both in terms of its membership and in terms of its scope, and what we need today is a new contract. Quoting here from Serres, "Back to nature then. That means that we must add to the exclusively social contract a natural contract of symbiosis and reciprocity, in which our relationship to things would set aside mastery and possession in favor of admiring attention, reciprocity, contemplation, and respect, where knowledge would no longer imply property, nor action mastery, nor would property and mastery imply their excremental results and origins." Serres has an entire book on pollution called Malfeasance. An armistice contract in the objective war, a contract of symbiosis, where a symbiont recognizes the host's right, whereas a parasite, another major trope and theme for Serres, a parasite, which is what we are now, condemns to death the one he pillages and inhabits, not realizing in the long run he's condemning himself to death too. So we've reached an inflection point, crossed a threshold. We are, as Serres says, casting off from one world into another. Again, quoting, "The term contract originally means a tract or trait or draft that tightens and pulls, a set of cords." I'm going to keep playing with this metaphor, which is one of Serres, the metaphor of the cord or the rope. "A set of cords assures, without language, the subtle system of constraints and freedoms through which each linked element receives information about every other and about the system, and draws security from all." We should recognize that every instance of casting off from one world to another requires that cords be fastened and unfastened. When a ship is going to leave port, it's unmoored from the dock before taking to the sea. When climbers leave the safety of the hut or the bivouac, they rope up before crossing the glacier. I myself am a lifelong climber, as Marjolijn knows, and all these images Serres used, he was an amateur climber as well, resonate with me so strongly. For those of you who don't know climbing, they're just the perfect image. So as Serres writes, quoting again, "When climbing, if the mountain finally turns out to be difficult, appallingly tough, then the contract, that is the cord, itself takes on a different function. It no longer binds just the mountaineers among themselves, that is the social contract, but in addition anchors itself to the rock face at specific strong points. That is, it is a connection to what Michel Serres calls hard reality, nature itself, the given." So again, really quickly to explain that, when you're just crossing a glacier with another climber, you're roped together so that if someone plunges through a crevasse, the other climber can arrest the fall. As you get onto steeper and steeper slopes and things become more difficult, you're actually affixing the rope to gear, whether it's fixed gear in the rock or removable gear in the rock, that anchors both climbers to the rock face as well. So the climbers are now linked to each other, but they're also linked to the world by the same cord or contract. The image is essential, I think, because a single cord or rope connects a person to both her partners and also connects the team or the group to the hard reality of nature. One contract, multiple relationships. So this is the last section. Although Serres himself does not make the point, I want to emphasize that reflecting on a natural contract, because of this, it's a single contract that connects the people and the community to nature, the people to each other and the community to nature. I want to emphasize that reflecting on the natural contract is going to force us to rethink the social contract. A social contract, the way we thought of it traditionally, is signed by individuals who, in so doing, leave the individualistic state of nature and form a society. But the natural contract that Serres is calling for is a contract between a group, the full group of humanity, and nature, taken as a whole, globally. The signatories of a social contract are individual humans, but the signatories of the natural contract are more than human nature, all of it, and humanity, all of us. In an age of global humanity affecting global nature, the natural contract presupposes an expanded and expansive social contract. And the prospects for a natural contract are dependent on the health of the social contract. We cannot simply add the more than human world to an existing interhuman social contract that's dysfunctional. Thus, to use only the most obvious example, there will be no solution to climate change. There will be no solution to climate change rooted in preserving existing social injustices, right? There is no possible solution where we simply freeze existing emissions or in which everyone cuts back some equal percentage. And in so doing, we lock in the affluence of the United States and Western Europe and lock in the poverty of parts of Africa, Western China, and South Asia. Right? Understandably and properly, people in the developing world are not going to sign a contract predicated on locking in their own poverty. If we force them to make a choice between burning coal for electricity or staying in the dark, they are going to burn coal. India has been very candid about this when we talk about this. If there's not development aid to help India pursue development in a low carbon or carbon neutral way, they're going to use the means they have on hand, which are all carbon intensive, because they need to lift people out of poverty. If 4/5 of the world refuses to join the social contract that will be signing the natural contract, it won't be signed at all. The United States cannot sign the natural contract on behalf of the world, nor can the global north. It has to be signed by humanity. As a quick side note here, as I was just looking at this before our meeting today, this incidentally is why I'm extremely pessimistic about our ability to really solve climate change at all. Our response to COVID-19 in some ways can be seen as a dry run, a test for international cooperation. And I think it's largely a test that we failed. Rich countries have tried to save themselves while leaving poor countries to fend for themselves. But neither a pandemic nor climate change is going to respect international borders. And there's no way that the United States can save itself from climate change without getting the rest of the world on board. We have to do this together. And so we need a new social contract. Serres is correct in saying that we need a natural contract, one that would include more than human nature as well than people, who were traditionally the subjects of the social contract. But redrafting the contract to include new signatories, that is more than human nature, is also going to require redrafting the contract to better reflect the rights and concerns of the existing human signatories. Serres does make a gesture towards a guiding principle for such a contract, which is framed, he says, by two double laws. Here he's playing on the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 22, in which Christ, asked to name the greatest commandment, that's a singular question, the greatest commandment, singular, responds with a kind of double law. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So he responds with those two to the question for a singular law. Serres' contract endorses something very like this logic in the first of his two double laws. 1, love one another. That's our first law. For 2,000 years, This is the only one that has been able to help us avoid, at least for a few moments, hell on earth. This contractual obligation is divided into 1A, a local law asking us to love our neighbors, and 1B, a global law requiring us to love at least humanity if we do not believe in God. It's impossible to separate the two precepts under penalty of hatred. But then he adds, 2, the second law. Here's a second law, which asks us to love the world. This contractual obligation is also divided into 2A, the old local law that attaches us to the ground where our ancestors lie, right? Whether that's England or Australia or Amsterdam or California, our local commitment to local environment, local nature. The old law that attaches us to the ground where our ancestors lie, and 2B, a new global law that no legislator, as far as I know, has yet written, which requires of us the universal love of the physical earth, taken as a whole. It's impossible to separate the two precepts under penalty of hatred. Here, Serres unites 4 laws, 4 loves, into a single contract, a single cord, connecting all the diverse beings in the world. We cannot separate love of this particular person from love of humanity, nor can we separate love of this particular part of earth from love of the earth taken as a whole. And uniting these 2 laws, we must recognize that we cannot separate love for other humans, the social contract, from love of the earth, the natural contract. Thanks very much. I hope timing of that worked about right. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Brian. So we have time for questions, plenty of time for questions. Anybody like to jump in? Yeah, Chris.
Thank you so much, Brian. I've been thinking a lot about the social contract recently, and that was incredibly helpful. This idea of one contract, the rope doing 2 things, incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. My question is sort of trying to push it forward a step, I guess, and coming round to this idea that you mentioned a couple of times of rewriting the social contract. And I guess I want to ask, what does that mean? So when Serres says we must add to the social contract a natural contract, my question is, what does that look like? Because, you know, of course, the social contract isn't written. So what does it mean then to rewrite it? Is it a case of civic education? Is it driven by politics? Is it driven by the media? Should it happen through legislation? Is it about changed individual behavior? Is it about a changed social imaginary? And if it's about all of those, in what order do they need to happen? And another way of framing the question is, who is the we who should rewrite this social contract? Can it practically be everyone? I mean, it would be nice to think it's everyone, but can that actually be the case?
That's a great question, and I hope I have an answer that's adequate to it. Let me begin by saying my own philosophical thinking tends to focus on the individual and the personal and the ethical. And Marjolein, in our long friendship together, has always been pressing me to be a little more political and think about the political ramifications of my thought. And it's again, it's a happy friendship. I'm glad that she does that for me. The second thing I'd want to say, and then I'll try and get more specific, is speaking again to Devin about environmental philosophy. When I give talks on climate change and climate ethics, which I do a fair bit, not just academically, but to the public, I often mention, I'm not clever enough to have come up with this image, but I can't remember who I got it from first, right? When it comes to climate change, there will be no silver bullet, right? We can't just sit back and hope someone's going to invent cold fusion and we'll have free energy. So there'll be no silver bullet. But if we're very hardworking and very cooperative and very creative and very lucky, we might just get some silver buckshot. And for those of you who don't fire guns, right, buckshot's the stuff you put into a shotgun. It sprays out a whole bunch of little pellets. And so, you know, one of those little silver pellets might be legislation. Another one of those silver pellets might be changing the social imaginary. Another one might be, I write a lot about kind of cultivating Aristotelian virtues that are responsive to the climate. So I would say it's an unhelpful answer, but all of the things you named, Christopher, are necessary. If we were going to do one, and here's my attempt to actually answer your question. Personally, I'm inclined to think about individual cultivation in a kind of Aristotelian sense, that we should try to change ourselves the way we relate to hard nature and reality, right? Which is a lot of the way I read Serres. Like a lot of the stuff in the five senses, I realize an appeal. I read as an appeal to kind of remember the hard, not to reject language, not to reject the soft, but remember the hard. So that's what I would do personally. But I think my final answer has to be to you that what this would mean first is if we could get politicians in office who would rewrite legislation with the idea of a just social contract in the background and the idea of a natural contract in the background. Because at the end of the day, climate change can't be solved by my individual virtues. You know, I bike around Los Angeles, I try to eat less meat, I try to fly less than I could otherwise by being invited places. I'm not perfect, but I try to do good work there, and it won't change anything. I wrote an article some years ago where I argued the keystone virtue for environmentalists is not, you know, Pache, someone like Thoreau, simplicity or something like that. The keystone environmental virtue is political activism, right? The best environmental virtue we can have right now is, in the United States, to use my own country as a thing, it has to become a voting issue for people. The same way in America, as I'm sure you all know and are horrified by, like gun rights are a voting issue here. Politicians go in and out of office depending on whether they're willing to let people carry assault rifles around their town. Once politicians go in and out of office depending on what they're doing about climate change and about the sort of environmental racism and environmental injustice that's going along with climate change, then something will happen. Is there a second? No, okay, sorry. I thought there was a second one in there.
Go ahead, Marylin.
Thank you, Brian, for an excellent paper. And I'll also say a bit more about the natural contract, but you've done a really wonderful job here. As sort of a follow-up to Chris's question, of course, that would have otherwise been my question, the political question that is. But I've also been kind of thinking alongside this new natural contract that needs to complement the social contract, do we also need a new academic contract? I think that's why I've been intrigued by Serres as well, namely his remarkable interdisciplinary approach to topics, which has made him such an oddball out there in continental philosophy, because he's actually doing what many of these continental thinkers say that they're doing, but he's actually doing it, namely studying physics and math and music and poetry. He's talking about, but I don't know how to think about it, he's talking about sort of a new biogeological science. Yeah. And that should be kind of the new academic language that connects the humanities with the sciences. So, so what do you think about that? Would we also need, as we think about a natural contract, do we also need to think through our own academic contract, namely, what would we study and how would we study, so that we can inform intellectually the formation of such a new contract, a natural contract?
Yeah, that's great. I had a silly grin on my face because as you asked that question, I mentioned to Chris as he logged on that I'm enjoying his book very much. I haven't finished it, but I told him that I was around page 62 and I'm sorry, 162. And I just finished his section on Serres' critique of academic language and the institution. So, I mean, this is something central to Serres' concerns. When I teach Serres to my undergraduates, I often start first with the book that's been translated as The Troubadour of Knowledge, which I think of his sort of, it's his philosophical reflections on education and epistemology and things like this. And it makes a lot of the cases that you're talking about. I do think that we need something like a new academic contract or intellectual cultural contract for the way that we think about knowledge more holistically. Devin and I were speaking just before everyone else logged in about the kind of unfortunate patchy familiarity with science among some environmental philosophers. And those of us who are trafficking in continental philosophy all remember the Sokol hoax, right? And the people who are caught up in that, which Christopher also mentions in a footnote in his book. I mean, Serres was named by Sokol as part of that, but kind of given a little bit of a pass for saying, like, he's a little bit more clear when he's using science as a metaphor and when he's talking about science as actual science. He doesn't muddy the two so much as Sokol thinks some other people do. So yeah, we do need something like that. PACT, which is an organization Marymount and I are part of, is good in that way. It's not just philosophers who show up there, but artists and activists and other people. We're experimenting with, well, it's not happening yet, but we're thinking of experimenting with new organizations here at my university where we wouldn't so much do away with departments, but we would organize kind of research groups around shared interests. I have a lot of common academic interests with colleagues who happen to be not in philosophy, but in theology or English or urban studies on the environmental and ecological angle. And you might form, as they tend to do more in Europe, so Marymount and Christopher might be able to speak to this a little bit more. You form research groups around topics for as long as they're vibrant, and then they can break up and you form different research groups over the course of one's career. That seems to me to make a lot of sense, instead of being chopped up into sort of narrow disciplinary fields. I will say that if we do that, we've got to be careful, because there's another trend in the US Academy, I assume it's probably global as well, not towards scientism in the sense that Husserl was, well, maybe towards scientism in the sense that Husserl was criticizing, right? There's this deference towards science and the so-called scientific method. I mean, I say so-called not because I don't believe in it, but because I don't believe it's singular. I mean, there are multiple scientific methods. The humanities become more like the social sciences are trying to ape the sciences. Ted Toadvine wrote a great article a decade or more ago called 6 Myths About Interdisciplinarity. And this is from someone who's a philosopher at Oregon at the time, working in very interdisciplinary research groups with scientists and social scientists and everything else. And there's a danger when you form these kinds of new groups to think that science discovers the truth, social science figures out how to implement it or react to it, like political science and economics, and then the humanities, like us, well, we're just like the town crier. We'll write some plays about it to communicate it to the public, or we'll write op-ed pieces for the socially awkward scientists who can't get published in the New York Times or something like that. But Toadvine is, I don't think I need to make this case to the rest of you. Toadvine is at pains in this essay I mentioned, the 6 Myths of Interdisciplinarity, to point out that the humanities, including and especially philosophy, bring something distinctive to the table. So we'd have to make those groups, it can't just be the philosophers that want this kind of interdisciplinarity. The biologists need to want it too, and the economists, for it to work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
So first of all, thanks a lot for that. This is the single book of Serres that has always left me with the most questions. And so I'm just going to ask you the question that has always bothered me. And it's this: what is it that motivates us to sign this new social contract? Let me explain what I mean by that. The notion of a contract, I think, makes sense in a world where you have a sphere where individuals have the right to pursue their own interests. So the notion of a contract is very instrumental. And what goes along with that, I think, is that when I sign a contract with you, what that means is I have a right against you, right? So if you do something that violates the contract, I take an adversarial stance toward you. And so my concern is that the notion of a contract introduces a kind of instrumental reason into a sphere where maybe it seems that that's the very form of thinking that has played such a big role in causing the problem in the first place. So I guess I asked, to what extent do we want to import our natural understanding of what a contract is, with its strategic reasoning, with its instrumental reasoning, et cetera? Thanks.
Nice. That's a great question, and I had not thought about it in those terms before, so I'm responding on my feet, as it were. So I think there is an instrumental aspect to what Sarah is talking about, evident in this whole framing of the book on Goya's painting, right? Let's stop hating each other because we're sinking into the mud and we're all going to die. Let's figure out a different way to deal with our disagreement. But I like what you've provoked me to think about here in terms of the contract. Maybe the language of a contract is too instrumental, and it might be better to fall back on these metaphors of relationship and community, and maybe even the chord that Sarah is so interested in, whether he's talking about sailing or climbing as an image. People don't talk this way anymore, but the generation of climbers that came before myself, there's a famous British climber named Chris Bonington, and he famously, he was being filmed by the BBC, and they went out to the cliffs to do a little film bit for the BBC, and somehow he brought all the gear with him to film, but he didn't have any rope. And so he just walked up to some other amateur climbers who were out there at the time, and he said, "Hey, look, we've scheduled this thing. Can you help me out?" And they stopped climbing themselves, and they gave Chris Bonington the rope so he could do this film for the BBC. Now, they probably did it out of hero worship or something like that, but when the BBC asked him on film, like, that's amazing. How come these other people just gave you the rope? And he just said offhand, it's the brotherhood of the rope, right? So if we stopped thinking in terms of contract and think a little bit more in terms of, not to be gendered, but a brotherhood, and a brotherhood that didn't include just human beings, but I also do some work in kind of philosophy of religion. I mean, but all the creatures, like if we thought of creatureliness instead of humanity, right? A cord connecting creatures, that might be more what we're after. And Serres does think this way, it sounds like you know, when he talks about parasites and symbiotes and other things like that. That might end up being, in the end, a more useful metaphor now that you've flagged this for me, especially because I do have these other commitments to ideas about the intrinsic value of the natural world and things like that might be, if not effaced, at least occluded by the kind of contractual metaphor, the same way that I have commitments to ideas about the dignity of other human beings that could be effaced or occluded when I think of them in contractual terms. So thanks very much for that comment.
Thank you.
All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. Chris Watkin is Associate Professor of European Languages at Monash University. His most recent work, as everybody knows, is the book on Serres, and I want to echo everybody's praise for it. Just wonderful, helpful book, but also works on Foucault and Derrida. His talk today is entitled Thinking in Figures, the Distinctiveness of Michel Serres.
Thank you so much, Brent. I'm just sharing my screen here. And has that screen share worked? Can you see my PowerPoint? Wonderful, wonderful, excellent. Let me just begin by saying how grateful I am to be here. Thank you so much to Brian for initiating the idea of the panel. Thank you to Marie-Elaine for your wonderful paper and also for your generous hospitality last year. Thank you to SPEP. This is my first SPEP, so it's all very exciting. And thank you to Brian L. as well for considering Michel Serres worth thinking about and coming to this panel. I'm going to try and do my very best to make it worthwhile for you and for anyone else who's listening. The line that I want to take in this paper is to explore not what Michel Serres thinks about this or that subject. And I'm glad not to be doing that, because the papers that preceded mine have done that so wonderfully. What I want to do is something a little bit different. I want to try and explore how Michel Serres thinks about everything. I'd like to show that his thought has a distinct texture, a distinct power that stands alongside contemporaries such as Derrida, Deleuze, or Foucault. And I'd like to ask some questions about the very idea of attempting to sum up or characterize the thought of a given philosopher, in a sense, a metacritique on what I'm trying to do in the paper as well. As has been mentioned, Michel Serres published consistently, and for those who work on him, infuriatingly, from the 1960s until his death in 2019. He authored, depending on how you count it, around 45 books on subjects of contemporary importance, ranging from ecology, as we've been hearing about, to the future of humanity, to the nature of social relations. He wrote 3 French bestsellers, and particularly impressively, he published 3 posthumous works after his death in 2019 as well. But if we want to understand how Serres thinks, I think we really do need to go back to his as yet untranslated magnum opus, which in English would be The System of Leibniz and its Mathematical Models. This is not a trivial thing to do, because it weighs in at 800 pages and around 300,000 words. And therefore it's substantially longer than Derrida's of Grammatology, which is about 230,000 words, and fractionally longer than Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plato's, 290,000, if you were wondering. It appeared in 1968, which is, of course, the same fabled year as those student riots in Paris and other French cities that nearly brought down the de Gaulle government, and the same year as the publication of Barthes' famous Death of the Author essay, 1 year after of Grammatology and Deleuze's Difference and Repetition, and 2 years after Foucault's The Order of Things. So it was quite a moment for French philosophy. In this book, we see the birth of a series of characteristic Serresian moves or patterns of thinking. And they really distinguish his thought from that of his contemporaries and make him quite a unique thinker in a way that Brian was wonderfully alluding to in his paper. Every thinker has their own distinctive moves, don't they? I just need to mention the terms archaeology or deconstruction or taking from behind, and you immediately know who I'm talking about. And Serres calls his own distinctive moves figures of thought. But I think what he's trying to pack into this idea of figures of thought is a richer and more subtle concept than simply generic patterns or tendencies in the way that he thinks. And I think we can get a handle on them by understanding them in terms of 3 features. So first of all, these figures of thought are algorithmic operators for Serres. They're complex functions for producing an infinite variety of outputs from an infinite number of possible inputs. Secondly, and this resonates very much with what Marie-Hélène was saying a moment ago, figures of thought for Serres are natural phenomena. They're not a cultural artifact. So, for example, species of flora and fauna are classed as figures by Serres. They're understood as new inventions or new branchings in what he calls the great story of the universe. So whatever figures may exist, and in whatever form and in whatever context they may exist, they all emerge, and I'm quoting directly from Serres here, they all emerge from the movement of the universe, of life, of the body, of cultures, in short, of thought. So there is then a fundamental continuity between the way that Serres understands the rhythm of nature and the way that he understands the rhythms of thought. Thirdly, these figures are also found in literature. So Ulysses, Don Quixote, Harlequin, Pierrot, the Grand Inquisitor, they're all figures, just as much as the daisy or the Fosbury flop or the pas de deux for Serres. And in each case, they draw together the general and the individual. These literary figures for Serres are actually superior to abstract ideas because they better represent the truth of ideas than ideas do themselves. So just to put some flesh on those bones, quite literally, a beautiful man or a beautiful woman is beautiful, Serres remarks, in a way that the abstract idea of beauty isn't. His figures, in other words, are not merely descriptive, they're also performative. They're not merely mimetic, they're also participatory. And this insistence on the one hand, the natural origin of figures of thought, and on the other, on their literary or their fleshy incarnation, I think sets his figures apart from other attempts to label philosophical moves. We might think, for example, of the philosopheme evoked by Derrida and others, or Deleuze and Guattari's concepts, which it's the business of philosophy to create, or indeed Deleuze and Guattari's conceptual personae from what is philosophy. And let's just dwell a moment on these conceptual personae, because I think they're the closest thing to a Serresian figure, but they're not quite the same. Conceptual personae are generic nouns, that they're categories that can be preceded with a definite article rather than named individuals. So we've got the friend, the enemy, the foreigner, the stranger, and so forth. Now, it's clear that Serres admires and draws from these conceptual personae, but there are also important differences between these and what he elsewhere calls his own character concepts. Because whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, the conceptual persona serves the creation of concepts, for Serres, the concept is actually a distillation and a reduction from the character that gives it life. So for Serres, the character is both the origin and the end of the concept. And so when he's asked directly in one of the books of interviews whether his character concepts are like Deleuze's conceptual personae in the sense that they are heteronyms of Michel Serres, this is what he answers. He says, no, in no way. It is, in fact, quite the opposite. If it were me, it wouldn't be interesting. What Deleuze defines basically is the equivalence between a character and a novel. Madame Bovary is me, Flaubert said. Now, in my case, the characters are true incarnations. Hermes, for example, is the man of the new age, when the paradigm of communication replaces the paradigm of production. He succeeds Prometheus. So that was a very quick sketch of what figures are for Michel Serres. I think the best way that I can try and communicate the distinctiveness of Serresian figures in the time that I've got left is to take us on a guided tour of two of them. So that's what we're going to do now. It's usual for a thinker to pit her or his interventions against what she considers to be a pervasive misconception in conventional thought. So, for example, we've got Heidegger's forgetting of being. We've got the logocentrism of Derrida's of grammatology. We've got the dogmatic image of thought in Deleuze's difference and repetition. So let's take that way of thinking and try and apply it to Michel Serres. What does Serres' thought oppose itself to? What is the question? What is the problem to which his thought is an answer? Well, the answer to that question, I think, is captured most succinctly in the term umbilical thinking. In anatomy, the umbilicus is the navel, isn't it? It's the fixed central point through which the fetus is fed. And in geometry, apparently, it's a now obsolete term describing a focus or the point on a surface through which all lines of curvature pass. In Le Système de Leibniz, Serres condemns what he calls umbilical disciplines. He also calls them queen disciplines that claim to speak a zero-degree truth, in relation to which all other idioms become metaphorical. If a discourse or a way of thinking is umbilical, it claims to be the single privileged access to plain, unvarnished truth, which all other discourses necessarily distort or falsify to one degree or another. So it's umbilical to claim that everything is at bottom economic or biological or psychoanalytic or anything else. Linguistic structuralism for Serres is umbilical because it assumes that the linguistic model, with its groups of transformation and its phonemes and its oppositional couples, can adequately account for systems of relations in non-linguistic phenomena such as myth. . And the Copernican revolution is umbilical when it assumes that the sun is the only heavenly body that can act as a fixed point. The Cartesian cogito is similarly umbilical insofar as it extracts the thinking thing from the harlequin-like complexity of life, and it erects this thinking thing as a narrow gate through which all truth must pass. In fact, for Serres, modernity is characteristically and irreducibly umbilical. It's obsessed with the search for the fixed point in terms of which to make sense of the whole. Serres' umbilicism, then, along with Derrida's logocentrism and Deleuze's dogmatic image of thought, is a narrowing. It reduces a complex state of affairs to one of its components, and it falsely denies difference. Umbilical thinking and logocentrism and the dogmatic image of thought all create dichotomies by simplifying or reducing difference. Umbilical thinking also bears similarities to other mid and late 20th century French diagnoses of the malady of modernity. Most notably, of course, Bruno Latour's modern asymmetric thinking that refuses hybrids. But all of these, I think, differ from umbilicism in that Serres' response to umbilicism is not to reject the definite or even actually the dogmatic out of hand. As I want to try and go on to show, he's got his own way of dealing with dogmatism that really doesn't reduce to any of these other approaches. Where Serres' focus differs from that of Derrida, Deleuze, or Latour, I think is in the prominence he accords to the idea of the queen discourse, the umbilical discourse, coming to control the plurality of other discourses, and the concomitant denial that any discourse or mode has a unique and irreplaceable truth. That's what he opposes himself to, both in what he writes and in the way that he writes. So to put it plainly, no one way of thinking or writing can be adequate to any given subject. That's the talk that he talks, but it's also the walk that he walks. And compare that to the other thinkers I've been mentioning. Deleuze is content predominantly to write in a philosophical register. Now, we can go back and forth over that in the question time if you like. And while Derrida doesn't touch on this as much as Serres, he gestures towards it in some ways in texts like The Double Session, but he nevertheless remains limited in his choice of discourses. When it comes to Serres, however, discursive plurality is fundamental to his approach. It's at the ground zero of what Serres is doing in each of his texts, a discursive plurality. So then, if umbilical thought characterizes what Serres opposes, his own approach is captured most adequately, perhaps, by this figure of opposition by multiplication that he mentions in Le Système de Leibniz. And he sometimes calls it opposition by generalization. So let's compare Deleuze, Derrida, and Serres on the question of truth to try and get a handle on what this opposition by multiplication is. Deleuze overturns Platonism by elevating the simulacrum to the controlling role in the conception of truth. Derrida disrupts the Platonic sun by destabilizing truth's origin and deconstructing its presence. But Serres opposes Platonic truth by multiplying it. And I think we can most readily understand this opposition by multiplication through his retelling of Plato's cave allegory. At its simplest, I think, Serres' response to Plato is to multiply the single Platonic sun into plural sources of knowledge. He takes the first step towards this by rethinking Copernican cosmology. So Copernicus places the sun at the center of the solar system, but Kepler's laws of planetary motion state that the elliptical orbits of heavenly bodies don't have actually one center, but two. The first almost exactly coincides with the location of the sun, but there's also, Serres says, a second focus, of which no one ever speaks, as efficacious and necessary as the first, a sort of second black sun. There's not one center when we're thinking about orbits, but two. In other passages, Serres moves beyond this bifocal paradigm, and he gives this multiplication of suns its own allegory, which I think sits very nicely and productively alongside Plato's cave allegory. Not this time a story of escaping the cave to find the light, but of actually descending into the cave that's, lo and behold, full of its own lights. It's drawn from the 19th chapter of Jules Verne's novel The Vanished Diamond, which describes an underground bejeweled cave into which the novel's heroes descend with lanterns, and in which light is reflected and refracted in thousands of crystalline prisms. The more I think about it, the more it really does seem to be a systematic rewriting of Plato's cave allegory. Let me suggest 5 ways in which that's the case. Number 1, Plato's captive has to leave the cave in order to find the light, but Verne invites us to enter the cave to find the light. Number 2, Plato has one central sun driving away the shadows, but Verne has one central shadow and 1,000 little suns. Number 3, for Plato, it's one single isolated captive, isn't it? It's the individual who breaks free and finds the sun. But Verne has 2 voyagers who experience the cave, and their twin lights multiply the effects of the reflections that they experience in the bosom of the cave. They pluralize the subject of truth significantly. Number 4, Plato's sun is transcendent, it's inhuman, it's overpowering, isn't it, in the cave allegory? But the torches that light Verne's cave are manufactured, they're human, they're unremarkable, as if Serres is rewriting and de-dramatizing Nietzsche's parable of the madman in Die fröhliche Wissenschaft. Serres' Vernean cave is the place where we must imagine Nietzsche's madman happy. Number 5, Plato's captive has the good fortune to exit the cave at noon, experiencing a shadowless sun on a cloudless day. But Verne's light, by contrast, is described in terms of the chaotic, fluid twinkling of possible glimmers, in Serres' words, which open 1,001 different refractions. So Serres' cave allegory is one of multiple, complementary, secular, qualified truth. He opposes Platonic truth not by overturning or deconstructing Platonism, but by multiplying the Platonic sun. And this opposition by multiplication is just one of Serres' figures of thought. But such figures don't stand alone in his writing. They cohere to form what he calls a global intuition, which he also describes as a new way of being in the world, or a different style of thinking and writing. Style, he says, as a method of seeing and understanding things. In the course of a conversation with Bruno Latour, he explains that, quote, "My goal is not above all to be right, but rather to produce a global intuition, profound and sensible." I think this is a really crucial sentence for understanding Serres' project as a whole. Because in evocative, poetic texts like Biogia and the Parasite, he's not primarily communicating information, but he's offering us a way of living in the world. He's giving us a set of textual and corporeal sensitivities and resonances that predispose us to certain attitudes and inclinations as we go about our daily business. He describes 5 characteristics of these global intuitions. I'd love to take a couple of minutes to step through them one by one. So first of all, intuition for Serres stands at the beginning of the creative process, both in the arts and in the sciences, the inventive process. It generates initial hypotheses that then need to be tested, the initial way of seeing the world that then needs to be explored. It's also a distinct form of understanding. So, for example, we come to an understanding of the vast duration of time since the Big Bang, either through computing it or through intuiting it. They're separate moments. And an intuition then is in an important sense, it's pre-rational, but it's not anti-rational, it's not arbitrary. Indeed, new intuitions can be demanded by new circumstances. They don't just parachute to us out of the sky. The development of non-Euclidean geometry is one example that Serres gives in the book on Rome, requiring us to understand the world differently, to intuit it differently. Secondly, Serresian intuition is, quote, profound and sensible. In other words, it's not exclusively intellectual, but Serres says whatever the activity you're involved in, the body remains the medium of intuition, memory, knowing, working, and above all, invention. So intuition then is corporeal. It's a pre-theoretical sensitivity to what Serres calls the rhythms and sounds of existence, out of which meaning and language emerge. And this corporeality, this pre-theoretical, pre-linguistic rhythmicality of Serresian global intuition sets it apart from the intellectualizing notions of worldview, or even from something like Deleuze's concept of the image of thought, indifference and repetition, which, although similarly global in scope, is primarily concerned with questions of reference and truth and representation, which is not the case for Serres' global intuition. Intuition, thirdly, is global. And intuition doesn't pertain to an isolated phenomenon or to a particular problem, but to the nature of experience and of the world as such, and specifically to what must necessarily be. An intuition isn't something that we experience in the world, but it's a way of looking at and a way of making sense of everything that we experience in the world. It's the how of our inhabiting the world, not a what within the world. Fourthly, Serres is not simply seeking to describe his global intuition, but he wants to produce it in his reader. And I think this is a really crucial point. An intuition requires cultivation. It requires reflection and mediation. It may come in a flash, but it takes work to inhabit it. So, for example, Serres argues that in order to intuit the vast time that's elapsed since the Big Bang and its implications for our understanding of ourselves and the world, we have to carry out a theoretical effort as well as an existential one, trying to live and understand the content and stakes of this new ancientness, he says. Fifthly, it also follows from this desire to produce rather than describe that Serres' style of writing is necessarily going to play an important role in inculcating in his reader the rhythms and sensibilities of his global intuition. His texts don't represent the global intuition. I thought Mary Elaine was bringing this out wonderfully in her paper. His texts participate in the global intuition. They invite their reader, indeed, to participate with them. And this accent on participation also sets Serres' global intuition apart from, for example, Foucault's epistemes in the order of things and the archaeology of knowledge. Because whereas Foucault's démarche is descriptive, and he refuses, doesn't he, to describe the archive of his own historical moment, Serres engages in an active construction of a new global intuition based on recent discoveries in the sciences and newly minted philosophical series. He's not shy of trying to describe his own moment. Sixthly, Serres is seeking, quote, not above all to be right. Now, let it be said loudly and clearly that this does not amount to a claim that he cares nothing for truth. What he's saying, rather, is that being right or wrong is a status within a particular global intuition of the world. It's a move within a particular game. And therefore, it's less, quote, profound and sensible than the global intuition that makes sense of it. Being right is a matter of verification. It's a matter of measuring something against an existing standard to see if it conforms. It's extremely useful, but it doesn't create anything new. Intuition, by contrast, is responsible for what Serres calls the great inventions of thought, such as Bergson's intuition that time is duration, or Galileo's that the universe is written in the language of mathematics. That's not a case of simply being right, but of generating a new framework, if you like, within which being right gains a new sense. So the identification of figures of thought and global intuition provides something of a path, the Greek hodos, through the 5 decades of Serresian thought. But as I conclude, what I'd like to do is take a step back and think about the broader question. To what extent can the identification of things like figures of thought furnish a method, a meta-hodos, for investigating other bodies of work and other thinkers? And the response, I think, hangs on what we understand by method. If we take it to mean that a certain set of figures of thought defined in Serres' specific sense and a global intuition with all the particular nuances that he gives to that term must be forced upon every given thinker, then no, it isn't transferable at all. Figures of thought and global intuitions are tools uniquely suited, I think, to getting to grips with Serres' thought. And they depose a more or less alien interpretative grid on any other thinker. But this method is powerfully transferable, however, if it's understood in terms of its own algorithms or figures, rather than the particular outputs of those algorithms in Serres' case. In other words, the method proceeds by paying attention to the local moves made in a body of thought or in a particular text, which may, or perhaps in very few cases may not, be repeated from one text to another in an author's work. And having assembled these species of figure, the method then explores to what extent they admit of genera with family resemblances. No assumption need be made about how the local moves in a particular philosopher's thought will or will not cohere into a global account, because all degrees of coherence and incoherence yield interesting insights about a given philosophy. Now, whether or not these figures cohere into a global intuition, the approach avoids, I think, the atomizing analysis of individual figures that sometimes besets commentary on philosophical texts. So as I close then, I want to offer a somewhat speculative thought, and as they say on Twitter these days, come at me on this one. So here it is. What every great philosophy offers us, beyond its propositions, beyond its concepts, is at bottom a global intuition. Not merely a way of understanding ourselves and the world, but a way of being in the world, somatically, affectively, psychologically, intellectually. It works, does this global intuition, on the axes of the visible and the valuable. It makes certain things in the world visible to us that we wouldn't notice otherwise, and therefore other things comparatively invisible. And it makes certain things and states of affairs valuable to us, and necessarily trivializes others in the process. And Serres' particular global intuition is, as the other papers in this panel have so wonderfully and eloquently shown, one that is acutely needed in our own day. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Open it up for questions if anybody has one ready to go. Yeah, Brian.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. I really appreciate that. I have a question about this idea of a global intuition and linked up to this claim that the goal isn't to be right. So I'm going to remember what you said, not exactly right, but at one point you said something like this. Sometimes the situation just calls for a new global intuition. And so if that's right, and it strikes me as right, it seems that our intuitions are in some sense responsible and responsive to how the world is, right? It seems like there's some kind of realism involved with that notion of a situation calling for something. And so I guess what I'd like to press you on a little bit is, what can it mean that a situation calls for a new global intuition? Because I think the most natural way to interpret that is the broadly Hegelian way, which is to say the new intuition is righter. It's more adequate to how the world shows itself. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what it would mean for a situation to call for a new global intuition. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Brian. I think that opens up something really, really important. I'd love to answer by circling back to the other Brian's paper and this idea of a natural contract. And I guess what the natural contract is reaching for, part of what it's reaching for, is the idea that a new way of being in the world is precisely being called for today And the reason that we can use that language is that we notice, for example, to use that Goya image again, that we are sinking into the quicksand, and that can only happen for a certain amount of time before there's nothing left of us to sink. And to the extent, therefore, that we think our own lives something worth saving, we might want to take account of that in the way that we position ourselves in the world. So that would be one instance of calling for, and so it's not absolute. We could choose not to value our lives, for example, and carry on living just as we are, and not hear any call at all. But that seems psychologically perverse, and ecologically murderous. And, to the extent that most people would share that view, yes, there is a call. I am responding to something outside me. Now, I think it is probably worth qualifying that by saying that different people will hear different sorts of call. That there is a call to maximize profit, perhaps, that would militate against the sort of natural contract. So it's not as if there's only ever one sort of call, but I think that's where deliberative democracy comes in, and it's important to have these debates and sort of move towards a consensus. And I think there is broadly a consensus emerging. So there are certain guardrails. So reality provides certain guardrails. I can't just say anything at all. I can't just invent something off the top of my head and say that that's calling to me. It doesn't work like that. But neither is it that there is one unitary, insistent, unmissable cry to which one can understand or not. That there is a certain wriggle room, but it's not infinite.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Christopher. It was great, and I've got lots of different questions, and as I finish your book, I'm sure I'll develop others. But this one's a little more personal for me, and I just wonder, given how well read you are with Serres' full body of work, I'm wondering about your impression. So I've got right on the other side of my computer here, I have pinned up on my board above this position where I do a bunch of my writing, a little bit from Serres where he says, when a person writes, he reads very little. There's not a lot of time. If one read everything, one would never write. Inversely, writing devours life because it requires a crushing and monastic schedule. So I have become fairly ignorant, especially in philosophy, which is what I secretly hoped for, right? And so that's Serres, just talking about the obvious point we all know from writing our dissertations, that at some point you've got to stop reading and start your writing and stuff. But I'm sure this is partly a personal anecdote, but sometimes we look for the philosophers we like to agree in some certain way. And I'll just say, coming to Serres later in my life, after having been formed by hermeneutics and Paul Ricoeur and other figures like this, I won't say that there's a fair bit of similarity between Ricoeur and Serres, but I'll say there is a fair bit of similarity between the way I read Ricoeur and the way I read Serres. And I'm wondering if Serres' own admission that, I mean, obviously, in a sense, it's a false modesty when he says he doesn't read very much. He clearly reads everything. But in those same conversations with Latour, he points out how his own figures of thought, his own style of thinking, didn't fit into the educational system that he was in. And so there seems to be a kind of concession that, like, no, I don't really read Husserl that carefully. I don't really read, I mean, I've read Heidegger, I'm sure he's read these people, but I don't think he reads them by choice. I don't think he reads them super carefully because he's got his own project, which is somewhat different. So here's the actual question after that preamble. On the face of it, hermeneutics and Hermes, there's a kind of parallel to what's going on. And to what extent do you think that there is at least a family resemblance of a shared project there between the hermeneutics, maybe not of Derrida, if we call deconstruction radical hermeneutics the way Jack Caputo does, but at least of the sort of the hermeneutics of like Ricoeur, which as one last point, Ricoeur is famous for he does endorse and value the hermeneutics of suspicion, but it's always married with the hermeneutics of affirmation, the hermeneutics of trust, and the trust is exactly what Serres wants. So I'm sorry, that's a long question.
But a really profound question. Let me attempt to do it some semblance of justice. I think there's a quote somewhere, isn't there, where Serres says, read everything and then write as if you haven't, or something like that. And I think that's the reality behind that sort of quotation above your desk, which I think is indeed something of a false modesty. And I think that the reason that he's so desperate to write as if he hasn't is that he's allergic to this industry of critical commentary. And the reason that he's allergic to it is that it doesn't invent anything. There's no bifurcation. There's no rameau. There's no branching in that. And for him, that is what the whole of the universe is about. From the Big Bang onwards, it's all been about branching, as he says in Rameau, and therefore what we ought to be doing when we write is inventing. That's where the rubber hits the road for Serres. And so I think in the quotation that you read out, he says, I have become ignorant. And I think that become is a very pregnant term there. He's learned ignorance from the position of having read everything in order that he may then write in a way that doesn't merely regurgitate what he's read, but seeks to invent and to branch in different ways.
That's a great observation and great response. Thank you.
Yes, Maryline.
Glad to be back. My wireless had some issues here. I'm glad to be rejoining. Maybe this question was asked, but maybe, and if so, just my apologies. But my question, first, thank you, Chris, for a wonderful, comprehensive interpretation, really rich. My question really focuses on the global part of the global intuition. So taking Brian Luke's question a little bit further, like I'm intrigued by what exactly this notion of global means. I'm thinking about sort of the language that's being used in biogea, which is much more a local kind of language. It's still calling us with that famous or questionable we to change our language. But I mean, if it is the case, as he's arguing for, that we're always responding out of a certain place in contact with the elements, with our own bodies, what would such a global intuition look like? It sure enough cannot be the global of global capitalism. Might it be closer to something like the idealistically viewed internet, which could be rhizomatically global? Questionable there. What exactly are you up to with that term global? But yeah, what other, maybe I'm also asking, what other synonyms in Serres would you think replace something like global, which is so tainted these days? Okay, question.
Thank you. I'm so glad you could reconnect and ask that question, but I'm not sure exactly how to answer it. I think to do the easy part first, when he speaks about global intuition, it's global in the sense of it conditions all of my experience. So it's not how I look, for example, merely at politics or merely at the quote unquote the environment, but it is a way of being in the world that I always carry with me and I always inhabit. It's global in that sense. But you're absolutely right. The global is playing a really important role in his thought. And I think, again, this brings us back to themes that that Brian was discussing in his paper. I'm just trying to think through to what extent we can call the natural contract a global contract. It seems to work in the sense that it's the first. So we're living, one of the points that he makes in Le Contrat Naturel is that we're living in the first moment where the world itself is a thing. It's entered our thinking in a way that before the world as such hadn't. And therefore there's something global in the sense of the globe as the world about the way that we must think today that's new. And therefore the natural contract is a way of seeking to come to terms with that new globality. And therefore it seems fair enough to call it a global contract. And that might be an interesting way of thinking about it. He does a lot with the idea of the universal as well in his thought. It's perhaps one of the more problematic aspects of his thought, and I do talk about this a little bit in the book, that he seems sometimes overly wedded to an unreconstructed Enlightenment universalism that rides roughshod over the local in ways that perhaps other thinkers do better justice to. So I wouldn't necessarily want to deploy that aspect of his thought too much. But I think certainly the idea of a global contract perhaps gets at part of what you were raising there.
Yeah, thank you. It's intriguing. I'm also, I like your interpretation there of wanting to stay away from the universal. But then the issue is how to connect the local with the global. Yeah. Thank you.
Because he also has all the talk of the pagus and the local on some level. So I mean, I don't have anything to add really, except that is a good question, Marjolein, and an important one to think through for our reading of Serres, how to connect those two.
I mean, one thing to say is that his universal is not declarative like Descartes, but he uses the image, doesn't he, of a Google search, that you build up universality from a myriad individual examples rather than defining it top down. And so I think that's important to add, that when we're talking about the universal in a Serresian frame, we're not talking about a sort of a definitional declarative universal, but an algorithmic universal.
An a posteriori one as opposed to an a priori one. So I'm just going to assert my privilege here and get in a very quick question. I really like your discussion of umbilical thinking and the comparison of the Vermes story as multiplying sons. I wonder if you would also be willing to grant, as just a parallel, you also have a multiplication of caves in Serres, right? That everywhere he turns, he finds another black box, out of which everything, footprints come out of, or whatever, happens to be the image of the moment.
Yes, absolutely. I think the cave for Serres is the shadow within which the different lights glimmer. So I don't think in the Verne passage he's not wedded to the idea of a cloistered space. That's not what he's getting from it. What as you rightly allude to there, what he's trying to draw from that is the idea of many glimmering lights reflecting from each other in a space of shadow.
So that brings us to the end of our scheduled time. I don't know if anybody has closing comments or anything, I do want to thank everybody who presented and chatted today. It was wonderful. I was given a choice of which panel I wanted to moderate, and without hesitation, I said, Serres, I want to do the Serres. I've just become smitten by him over the past couple of years, and have abandoned almost all other work just to read more Serres. So this has been really nice to see what other people are doing with Serres and to hear other people talk about it. But yeah, just open it up for any other closing comments with my gratitude for joining us.
I'll just say as well, I'm going to have to cut out to a departmental meeting that's already begun without me. But it's nice to see that both Brian and Brent are also interested in this. I hope we all keep in touch, periodically over the coming months and years on this sort of stuff. Certainly at some point, I'm sure I'll be reaching out to you, Christopher, to try and I know in a post-pandemic world, getting people physically places is sometimes challenging, but it would be great to get you out for a talk, either Zoom or in person. So that's my final word. Thanks for everyone. Under these conditions, I know we had all hoped to be together at the conference when I initially conceived of the panel, but it's great to see you virtually and to hear your papers, and I'll be in touch. Hopefully I'll see you soon, and enjoy the rest of your time, Marjolein. Nice to meet the rest of you.
Yeah, and thank you, Brent, for your very collegial chairing.
Yes,
my
indeed.
pleasure.
All right.
Easy to do.
Thank you everyone, and also to Devin for being there, and Brian, both Brians and Chris Ben. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Ciao.